In chapter 18 of 1 Kings, where Elijah's story continues, and this is probably the event he is most well known for. Elijah burst onto the scene in the previous chapter and declared that there would be no rain as long as Ahab supported and worshiped the Baals rather than God. And Elijah prayed and it didn't rain for a good long time, to the point that God said, hey, kings don't generally like it when you tell them that they're doing things wrong, so you need to go hide out by a brook. And he did. And so he had water, and he was fed by the ravens. There's just all kinds of weird things about that to me. I don't know that I want to eat food that a raven's been touching, but that's just me. Beggars can't be choosers, and God provides in very unique ways for Elijah. But eventually that resource dries up. There's no more water in the brook. And he says, listen, you need to go to Phoenicia, right? A town called Zarephath in the country of Phoenicia, which was under the rule of the city of Sidon. And there's a reason he sends him here. One, this is how God is going to provide for him. He sends him to a widow. We talked about the widow of Zarephath last week. And her remarkable faith in providing a meal she really couldn't afford to the prophet. And so she acts in faith, and for the entirety of the time that Elijah stayed with her, her oil never ran out, and she always had flour, so she always had food. God provided for her in that way, and in that way God provided for Elijah. But it's interesting, because when you look geographically, Zarephath was in the center of Phoenicia, which was the center of Baal worship. So in the middle of a territory where Baal is supposed to be God, he has no ability to provide for the needs of his people. Whereas the prophet of God goes into the midst of Baal's territory and is able to perform miraculously provision for the widow and her son and for Elijah. And we left our text last week, and Elijah had raised her son from the dead. He had become sick, and he prayed, and God heard his prayer. There is something to be said for Elijah and his prayer life. When he prayed, God listened. And I don't want to oversimplify things, because prayer is most of the time more about changing us than it is God. But you can't deny what James says, that the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And so there is something to be said for when God's people live faithfully in his covenant, when they pray, things happen. Right? Not because of their power, but because of the power of God moving through his people. When God's people are obedient to his covenant, and Elijah is pretty much standing alone here, God is doing a miraculous work through him. But it's time. It's been a good long while in the third year of this famine where there has been no rain. It was rather dry. In chapter 18, verse 1, it says, "Now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, 'Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth.' And so Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over his household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, for when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water. And then Ahab said to Obadiah, 'Go through the land to all the springs of water, to all the valleys. Perhaps we will find grass and keep the horses and mules alive and not have to kill some of the cattle.'" I want you to know something about Ahab here. Ahab is looking for water, not for his people, for his horses. See, Ahab is all focused on his things, the things that make him powerful and rich, things that benefit him, right? But he is the king of God's covenant people, and he is supposed to be looking out for their good. And the problem with the king looking for water is that he's not trying to provide for his people, he's trying to provide for himself. And not for the needs of his people, but for the wants of him wanting to keep horses, which, if you'll look in other parts of Scripture, when there are commands for the kings not to gather horses. Like, what's wrong with gathering horses? I like horses. I do too. But for Israel, horses had to come from somewhere that was not Israel, which meant that they were philandering with other nations and other gods. And the acquisition of horses became this temptation for wealth and power that the king of Israel was never supposed to have. See, the king was supposed to rule his people and to direct them to keep the covenant. But he failed miserably. Ahab, one of the worst, because instead of leading them to worship, Yahweh is the name that God gives himself, or at least the closest approximation we can get in English to the Hebrew letters. Yahweh is his name. And when you see Lord in all caps, that's Yahweh. We don't translate that because of respect to the Jewish tradition and not saying the name of God. But that is a later tradition. Elijah says the name of God, proclaims it boldly, gives him a name so that he can distinguish him from the gods of the nations around them. And it's important that we make a distinction that when we say God at Cowarts Baptist Church, we are talking about the only God who exists, who manifested himself and put himself in flesh in the form of a man named Jesus Christ. See, Elijah was very specific about who he worshiped, who he served, who he was a prophet of. He said, I am a prophet of Yahweh. Ahab did not worship Yahweh, or if he did so in addition to the Baals and the Asherahs and all the other strange deities that his wife had brought in. And so, verse 7, as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him, and he recognized him and fell on his face and said, Is this you, Elijah, my master? And he said to him, It is. Go say to your master, Behold, Elijah is here. And he said, What sin have I committed that you are giving your servant into the hand of Ahab to put me to death? As Yahweh your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to search for you. And when they said, He is not here, he made the kingdom or nation swear that they cannot find you. And now you are saying, Go, say to your master, Behold, Elijah is here. It will come about when I leave you that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you where I do not know. So when I come and tell Ahab and he cannot find you, he will kill me. Although I, your servant, have feared Yahweh from my youth. Has it not been told to my master what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord, that I hid 100 prophets of the Lord by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water? And now you are saying, Go say to your master, Behold, Elijah is here. He will then kill me. Obadiah is a unique individual in this story. Some say it is possible that he is the Obadiah who wrote the very tiny Old Testament book of Obadiah. Maybe, maybe not. It was a common enough name. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, that the only guy mentioned by name as Obadiah is the same guy who wrote that book. But Obadiah is an interesting character because he is faithful to serve Yahweh. He does not worship the Baals. He rescues prophets that Jezebel is trying to kill, and yet he still serves in the household of the king. A king who is vehemently against worshiping Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And so the question becomes, how does someone, a true believer like Obadiah, work in the house of the king and maintain his faith, maintain his priorities as a Yahweh worshiper and not bow to the Baals? Extremely difficultly. It's hard to work in an environment that does not foster your faith and remain faithful. Obadiah is an example for so many of us who work in environments that, let's be honest, some of you work in places that might be hostile to your faith. At the very least, they want you to just keep that to yourself. Don't make a fuss. And so Obadiah kind of shows us what it means to live faithfully in the midst of a culture that does not want or care about your faith. You see, Obadiah served faithfully. He did his job well. Some of the early Christian apologists, and when I say apologists, I mean they were defenders of the faith because the Romans persecuted Christians. They wouldn't let them hold jobs. They threw them in the arenas. They killed them. And there were all kind of rumors about what Christians did and what they believed. They called us cannibals because we eat flesh and drink blood, talking about the Lord's Supper. Rather than understanding it symbolically, they took it literally. And that was the rumor. And so some of the Christian apologists had to go on the offense and say, hey, guys, listen, you really need to take a closer look at who we are and recognize that we are some of the best workers that you have. You got a Christian Roman soldier, he's one of the best Roman soldiers that there is. You got a Christian working in the courts of the emperor, he is one of the best courtesans there is. I wonder if that same defense can be made today. Is Christianity a mark of a good worker? Because it should be. It should be. You see, Scripture tells us that we are to do everything as if we're doing it for God, even if we're doing it for a boss who hates our guts. Right? So the idea here is that Obadiah did his job well. Right? He was entrusted by Ahab to go and search for water. Right? Say what you will about Ahab and all his motivations and what he was doing, but he recognized a good worker, and Obadiah did his job well to the point he was recognized as a good worker. And the reason he was because he was faithful to keep his covenant with Yahweh. He was a faithful covenant worker. Now, what that meant when his boss wanted to do bad things like kill the prophets of Yahweh was that he didn't obey him. Right? When the boss's wife wants to kill all the prophets of God, he says, hey guys, there's a couple of caves I'll hide you in and I'll bring you food and water. And he sustained them and rescued them from persecution. You see, Obadiah made a distinction between being good at his job and being obedient to God. Strangely enough, it didn't cost him his job. Probably because they didn't know about that, because Jezebel wasn't exactly known for being lenient with people who didn't follow her orders. But even in the midst of this, in the midst of an impossible situation, Obadiah is trying to remain faithful. Right? Even while serving a faithless king, he is trying to be a faithful follower of God. And he's a great example for so many of us who work in that same situation. So when you are tempted to just slack off because you really don't like your boss or that supervisor is giving you a hard time, here's the thing. Do your job well. Let your actions speak for themselves. And when people ask you, man, why are you working hard for that jerk? You can tell them, I'm not. I'm working hard because I follow Jesus, and Jesus wants me to do well at everything that I do and do everything as if I'm doing it to him. That's a hard word, isn't it? That's hard. If your boss is a jerk, you don't want to do well. If you work in a hostile work environment, it's not conducive to your best work. But if we change our mindset to say, hey, if I can do this job as if I'm doing it for Jesus, I'll do it to the best of my ability. And people see that. And it's not something that this world does. It's something distinctive to those who follow Jesus. Make being a good worker a defense for your Christian faith. But Obadiah says, listen, I would love to do what you're saying, but here's the thing. I think it's going to cost me my head, because every time somebody says, Elijah's over here, Ahab can never find him. And he says, just as soon as I go and tell him, God's going to spirit you away, and we're not going to be able to find you, and I'm going to lose my head. And Elijah says, not today. He said, I've been hiding out at the brook. I've been hiding out with the widow at Zarephath, but the time has come. He says in verse 15, Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. Sometimes God leads us to a confrontation. Now, there are a lot of guys out there who are in the same job that I'm in, who are extraordinarily confrontational over absolutely the most ridiculous things. And it's not because, my conscience has led me, it's because they like being jerks, right? Jesus is not an excuse to be a jerk, right? We're to be loving and winsome and truthful. And you can do those things without being a jerk, right? Standing up for Jesus does not mean losing your witness. It means simply stating truth in the most loving way you can. And sometimes God leads us to a confrontation so that we can show that. Elijah says, I'm not running from Ahab anymore. God's got a reckoning for him and his Baal worshipers. And for Elijah, he was called to that moment where God says, you know what? We're done. It's time for the king to come face to face with the true God. To recognize what he is rejecting, so that when he does reject it, he knows exactly what he's done. So Elijah basically says, bring it on. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is this you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah said, I've not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals. Now then, send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. And so Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Elijah throws down the gauntlet. It's one of my favorite stories, because the prophet just like, here I stand. Let's go. He chooses the spot, right? There's a reason he chose Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel sits at a very high point in Israel, overlooking towards the sea. And it was an area where there was a lot of altars and worship centers for Baal. This was the epicenter of Baal worship at the time. In previous generations, there had been an altar to God in this same location. And Ahab's family had torn that down and built up all kinds of worship places to Baal and the Asherahs. All of it some sort of false doctrine, all some sort of false god to meet some sort of human desire. On Wednesday nights and in small groups on Sunday mornings, we're talking our way through the Exodus and the covenant. Why it was so difficult for God's people to worship him instead of statues, instead of idols, instead of images of some weird conglomeration of animal and human parts, right? Today, if you were in small group, you talked about how Israel worshipped golden calves. Why golden calves? What is this golden calf? What has it ever done for them? Nothing. Nothing. We make fun of them for, let's be honest, some of us look at that and be like, why are you bowing down to a golden cow? That's dumb. Or you have some tree carved with poles and all kinds of things, and you do all kind of weird worship practices around that. Like, why would you do that? Right? Culturally, that's not a temptation for us, right? We don't bow down to idols. We don't serve these strange gods. Each of those gods represented something, some desire of the human heart. And it was a way that we had control, right? Because humans like control. You see, Baal had to be convinced to do things your way. And he could be. If you offered the right offering, if you said the right incantations, if you did the right dance and prayers and all this, then the superstition was that Baal would send a great harvest. Well, Elijah has prayed for 3 years that it wouldn't do that. And Baal couldn't do anything about it because Baal didn't exist. Baal was just the human nature in which we want to control the uncontrollable. If we worship the Baals, we'll have good crops. If we worship the Asherah, our wives and mothers will have babies. It was some way to meet some desire of the human heart. And if you don't think you have an idol in your life, look closer. Because there's something you can do where you can control what is otherwise uncontrollable. And in reality is. You see, what I've found is that most of the time when people finally come to Jesus, it's because the thing that they had been worshiping, the thing that they were using to control all the things in their life suddenly failed. Kind of like Baal. People of Israel were saying, hey, I want to have good crops, and I want my children to be blessed and not die, and I want my wife to have babies. And you know what? if I worship the Baal, maybe that'll happen. And in 3 years, there was no rain, no crops, which by extension, you probably don't have a lot of babies during that time, at least not any that survive. And you're like, wow, that's a really cruel punishment that God put on them. No, that's the natural consequence of breaking the right creation order that God has instituted, right? When we don't worship God, when we sin, it's a breach of God's creation. We mar it, we entangle it and ensnare it in all kinds of things it was never meant to have. Right? When Adam and Eve ate from the fruit, one of the curses was that the ground would grow thorns to choke out crops, so it would be difficult. Man has to sweat so he can eat. It wasn't always like that. You see, it's the sin of not worshiping God that breaks creation. The reason sin is such a problem in the world, it's not God's problem, it's man's problem. And the good news is that God makes it his problem, because he could wipe it out in an instant, but he doesn't. Because what he wants, even in the midst of Elijah, I mean, let's be honest, there's not a lot of love lost between Elijah and Ahab, but everything about this encounter is God reaching over and slapping Ahab in the face and saying, wake up. Everything you're doing is causing your failure. Serve me, worship me, because I'm the one you're supposed to worship. I'm the one you were created to worship. If you will worship Jesus. I'm not saying your life's just going to fall into place and everything's hunky-dory, but things just work. Things just work. Why? Because it's the way you were designed. There is a God-sized hole in every heart, and no Baal, no Asherah, no idol of this world, no power, no sex, no money, no nothing, no relationship, anything that this world has to offer. Nothing can fill that void that God has designed to fill. And so when they're worshiping the Baals, they're trying to fill that void that only God can fill. And you know what? There's a reason every time you try to fill that void with something in creation rather than the Creator who created you, it leaves you feeling empty. Why? Because there's nothing there. There's nothing there. Baal is a figment, and Elijah is about to prove it to the people. If 3 years of him being completely unable to send rains, because he is, after all, the storm god of the Canaanites, it really should be obvious by now that he has no power. But just to prove, Elijah says, let's do a test. At the very center of your worship practices, I want you to outnumber me 850 to 1. And you get to go first. And we're going to see which God answers with fire. I love it. I love it. Verse 21, Elijah came near to all the people and he said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. See, most of the people weren't full-on Baal worshipers. They're like, I like this Yahweh. He's like the covenant God that rescued us out of Egypt. Like, I feel like he's kind of important. But this Baal guy, he's got the corner on the crops and the fertility of the soil and our women. Like, I feel like we need to worship him too. Never mind that what did I teach our preschoolers this morning, Miss Tanja? The number one command. There is no other God. And you will have no other God before him. That's in front of him, beside him, instead of him. There's only one, and he does not share his glory. And the people are unwilling to commit to that. Here's the thing. So many people want the benefits of Christianity while maintaining one foot in the world. And the prophet says, you can't do that. You can't. You can't. There is no half-hearted devotion to God. None. It's all or nothing. Because here's the thing. God does not share his glory with another. He doesn't. He is the only God who is. His name, Yahweh, means I am that I am. He is self-existent. He depends on no one and needs no one. He is the one that all other things depend on. He is the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. He is what existed before there was an existence. It's God or nothing. He says the Baal does nothing for you. If Yahweh is God, follow him. And if Baal, follow him. But be sure you're following the right one, because you can't have both. Because one says, I don't share my glory. I'm designed for you and you for me. I've called you my people, and I've given you myself and said that I am your God. It's like a marriage. There's a commandment for that too. It's the seventh one, because there's 2 in a marriage, not 5. God does not share his glory. And if he is God, he is the only one worthy of worship, and nothing else is. Verse 23, or 22. Elijah said to the people, I alone am left, a prophet of Yahweh. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let them give us 2 oxen. Let them choose 1 ox for themselves, and cut it up, and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put a fire under it. And then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, on the name of Yahweh. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people said, that's a good idea. Right? Let's settle it once and for all. Who can handle the business of being God? Can Baal? Can Yahweh? Let's find out. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose an ox. Prepare it first, for you are many. And call on the name of your God, but don't put fire under it. And then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. And y'all thought our services were long. Saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice. No one answered. And they leaped about the altar. They were a little Pentecostal. And it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them. I love Elijah. He's petty. He's not content with them making fools of themselves. He's got to drive it home for him. Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice. He's a god. Either he's occupied or gone aside or he's on a journey. Maybe he's asleep and needs to be awakened. The NASB did it politely. He told them, hey, yell a little louder. Baal may be in the bathroom. Maybe he just took a nap. I mean, surely this God you have served, there's 450 of you, and y'all been dancing around and acting the fool all morning. Surely he'll answer you. Just yell a little louder. I love it. Verse 28, so they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out on them. When midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Let's be honest. The Baal worshipers had a lot more commitment to their worship service than a lot of us have. From morning until well into the afternoon, they yelled and danced and cut themselves. See, that's the thing about an idol. The thing about a God you have that's not the actual God is he can't give you anything. All he can do is take. See, they were yelling, pay attention to us. Listen to us. We need the fire to show that you're really God. I mean, you got to give it to them. They were committed. To the point that they are cutting themselves with swords and lances. They're pouring their blood out on this altar, trying to make this God do what they want. They're killing themselves in service to a God with no voice, that cannot answer, that does not pay attention. You know, there are a lot of gods like that in our world. There are. Man, the big three, right? Sex, money, and power. You can serve them and give yourself to them. And maybe even the culture around you will go, and at the end of the day, you know what you'll have? Nothing. Nothing. A relationship, as good as a gift from God as it is not designed to fulfill you the way God is. All the money in the world cannot buy you the fulfillment that God can. Because it's just stuff. Ultimately, it's His stuff. You just get to borrow it for a while. Power, fame, whatever you want to call it. The need to be significant in the eyes of those around you is empty. Empty. You will not find value in money. You will find value in Jesus. Because God the Father declared that the worth for your soul was the life of His Son. You will find no significance in this world that can fulfill you. But the God who lays down His life to redeem you from your sin, that's a good one. Might not want to let that one go. You see, we can serve idols, but they have no voice. They will not answer. They do not pay attention. They are takers. They are destroyers. They're killers. They'll take everything good in your life and destroy it and leave you with nothing. That's what idols do. Why? They cannot bear the weight of worship. It's taking these things and throwing it into a bottomless pit. You will never fill it up with the things of this world, because that bottomless pit in your very soul is designed to be filled with the God who created you. Ultimately, that's what Elijah's proving to the people. He says, this Baal that you've been worshiping for so long, he doesn't answer. He doesn't give you anything. He's not paying attention to you because he's not there. There's only one who is. He's about to answer. I love it. Verse 30, Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." See, Elijah doesn't want there to be any misunderstanding. He wants very, very close. He says, "Come near." Don't be hanging out at the back. Don't be chattering in the back row. No. Come close, because I want you to understand what's about to happen. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of Yahweh which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And so with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Yahweh, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. And when he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood, and he said, "Fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar. And he also filled the trench with water. He said, come close, I want to show you something. He said, that altar over there that's been broken down, that nobody's used to worship Yahweh in, I don't know, a few generations. He says, we're going to fix that. And he does the same thing that Joshua and the priests did when they first walked into the promised land. This was a fulfillment of God's covenant with them. God had brought his people into this land hundreds of years before this. And while they were walking through on dry land in the midst of the flooded Jordan River, just like Moses walked through the Red Sea, they stopped in the middle, everybody crossed over, and Joshua said, I need you to go and get me 12 stones. So they walked back into the river, dry riverbed. If you've ever seen the Jordan at flood stage, that's not a small river. It's miles wide. So they go back in on dry land because God stopped it up. And they pulled out 12 stones and they built a monument there. So they would always remember the God that they had made a covenant with, who had been faithful to bring them out of the wilderness and into the land he had promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Because God always is faithful, even in the midst of a faithless people. So Elijah, with all of that history, rebuilds that altar. And he prepares his sacrifice, and then he says, I want you to put water on it. That's a rather scarce commodity right now. He says, but I want you to soak it. So they pour big old buckets of water on it. He goes, do it again. Like, man, you get into my canteen. Like, it's a long way to walk back home. I'm going to be thirsty. He goes, do it again. 3 times he tells them to soak it, to the point that his sacrifice, his wood, and the trench he had dug around the altar are completely soaking wet. And then, with all the odds against him, he prays. In verse 36, it says, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. That's a lot shorter service than the Baal worshipers had, isn't it? 2 sentences. He says, let it be known who you are. You know, that's the most important thing I can do every Sunday when I get up here. It's not about me. It's not about if got a good sermon or a bad sermon or an okay sermon. It ain't nothing about me. It's every Sunday morning when I get up here and I open this word, I pray what Elijah prays here. Let it be known that you are God. Let it be known that you are God. If you can figure that out in the 45 minutes that I'm usually up here, I did an okay job. The most important thing you can do today is walk out of here knowing who God is and that his desire is to have your heart. You see, he had a covenant relationship with his people, and they had walked away from it, and yet he is still pursuing them. He sent Elijah. Elijah was his messenger. Elijah had done everything according to the word of God, and he says, answer me, that this people may know that you, Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. And then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. When his fire fell, it consumed everything. Everything that Elijah could offer, all the water, all the stones, everything God consumed it all. Fire fell. God showed up and showed his people who he was. Showed them that the idol that they had been worshiping was absolutely powerless, but that the simple prayer of a man who loved and served the true God, he would answer. And he answered with fire. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape. And so they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon and slew them there. You see, that's the thing. When we turn our hearts back to God, when we've been serving the idol and God, and we finally let go of the idol, what God says is, don't go back to that, kill it. Kill it. Destroy the sin that so easily ensnares you. Do not return to it. Do not be tempted by it. He says, these men led you astray. They led you to worship something that was not even real. The true God is answered with fire. Don't let the deceit creep back in. Kill them all. It's like, man, that's rough. That's Old Testament God. That's the same God that sent Jesus to die in your place for your sin. When he's serious about destroying sin, he's serious about destroying his Son in our place for our sin. Worshiping him is a serious business. And there's no idol worth our worship. You know, it's the follow-up that often gets left out of this story, but it's just as important. Verse 41, Elijah said to Ahab, go up, eat, drink. There's the sound of the roar of a heavy shower. So Ahab went up to eat and drink, but Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, go up now, look toward the sea. So he went up and looked, said, there's nothing. And he said, go back 7 times. And it came about at the 7th time that he said, behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. And he said, go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, so that the heavy shower does not stop you. And in a little while, the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, and then the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. And he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. I don't know how many of y'all run. I don't. But Elijah, after proving who the true God was, remember, they still had the problem of there was a drought. When the people turn back to God, Elijah prays. He goes up on the mountain and he takes his servant with him. He tells him, I need you to go up and look out to the sea and tell me what you see. 7 times he went up there. You ever pray for something and God's like, nothing, just doesn't answer? 7 times Elijah prayed, and I'm sure Elijah's like, okay, God, it's really awesome that you can rain fire, but these people like need rain. It would be really great if you could send that. So 7 times he sends his servant back up. And the 7th time he says, there's a little cloud. If you hold your hand out, it's about the size of your hand. He says, you better go tell Ahab he needs to get inside. It's about to rain. And God said, Elijah, it's about to rain. You might want to get inside too. So Elijah runs. God empowers him to run faster than the chariot. That's just cool to me. That's a great visual, isn't it? Here's Ahab, clueless, dumb, ridiculous Ahab, eating and drinking, and Elijah's like, man, I'm old. I got a young servant. You can go tell him what's going on. Tell him to get to town. And God's like, yeah, you need to get to town too. And he's running ahead of him. It goes to show what happens when we worship Yahweh, the true God. That he supernaturally empowers us to do things that we normally couldn't do. And I don't know about running faster than chariots. That would be really cool. I don't run that much. But look what God has done. God has proven himself. He's answered with fire. And then the thing that his people really needed, the thing that had been promised would be the punishment for them worshiping the Baals. When they turn back to him, what happens? The blessings fall. The rain comes. Like I said before, following Jesus doesn't mean everything's going to be hunky-dory, but it's just going to go right. It's just going to go right. You see, because a tough day of following Jesus beats an easy day following the idols any day. And there's only one God who's worthy of your worship. He was the God who cared to answer. And he didn't just reveal himself through fire on the mountain. He revealed himself through blessings on his people. And ultimately revealed himself when he became one of us and dwelt among us and lived the perfect life that none of us have ever lived, but died the death that each and every one of us deserve because of our sin. See, because the God who judged the prophets, the God who rained fire down on the sacrifice, the God who judged the idol worshipers of the Old Testament, that's the same God who took on flesh and dwelt among us and stood in our place when God's wrath fell. Yeah, he's a just God, but he's a merciful and a gracious God, and he deserves our worship because nothing else can handle the weight, but he can.